Yeah, how many of you, raise your hands, have ever heard of the Liturgist podcast? 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, actually, you guys might be smaller in numbers, but you're fiercer in your knowledge. First service, almost no one had. It's kind of a hipster thing, but how many of you have heard of Michael Gungor, the musician? Same people, probably. All right, well, blah, blah, blah. Gungor's this Christian musician that kind of, I saw him at Catalyst Conference a few years ago, and does all this music, but he kind of left his faith. He kind of got disgusted by the religious American Christian thing and left his faith, came back to his faith, and he met a guy named Mike, that they call Science Mike, who had left his faith as a Southern Baptist deacon, and they both come back to their faith, and they kind of have this really philosophical podcast. Sometimes they have great guests on there and discuss controversial topics, but it's pretty cool. I like most of the Liturgist podcasts, but they were doing a Phoenix event, and we got VIP tickets, which means that we're VIPs, we're the real deal. We're like really special. So there's about 20 of us that paid extra money to go meet Science Mike and Gungor and do a service project for this refugee camp thing, which is actually really cool learning about that. When we got there, in pure common style, we were about 25 minutes late because we had gone to the wrong location first because we don't know what we're doing in life. We arrived, and it was no big deal because we had only just missed like introductions and all that stuff. All we had to do was grab a shovel. Nobody started working yet. So John and I were walking with a shovel, and all of a sudden this guy, this kind of nerdy-looking guy with Napoleon Dynamite glasses, kind of scrawny, kind of threw some dirt. Some of it hit me. He goes, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to throw dirt on you." And I just kind of took up a thing of shovel of dirt, just kind of threw it back on him, and walked off without acknowledging, because it was kind of like I wanted to say, I acknowledge that you're a human, but I don't really got anything to say to you. So it's kind of like we were flirting, but I didn't really want to get to know the guy. Because here's why. He kind of looked like the guy that I expected to show up at this. You know, it's kind of like I had a picture in my mind. I'm like, this guy is just one of these wannabe like band nerds that's here to be younger. So I walk over, and I'm like, where's Science Mike? And I figure out who Science Mike is. I'm like, all right, where's Gungor? And I start looking around. And you guys can probably start to connect the dots of why I'm telling the story. It was Gungor that I threw dirt on, which is pretty cool. I like that. And I actually never talked to him after that. That was my only encounter with him. But what was really cool is Kyle and Greta got to talk to him, which was really, really what I was hoping for. Because Kyle actually knows his brother and this other band, Towers, has toured with them. And they had a connection. And they were talking it up for a while. I'm sure they were talking about how tight to have a man bun or whatever else they were. It's their thing. And but then I had what I wanted. I got to sit down next to Science Mike at lunch. We had lunch afterwards. There was a seat open. So I sat with Science Mike to pick his brain and talk to him about science stuff. The reason I tell you all that is to transition to where we've been the last few weeks, because he told me a really cool story. I was asking him about his book that's about to come out, and he told me a story, a scientific snippet from that book that really fascinated me. So here's the scientific little story that he told me. There's this thing that happens in neurobiology that's called split brain. I know it's a really hard term to understand. But what happens is there's this thing called the corpus callosum, I think is what it's called. It's the thing that connects the two brains. First service, there's like 3 people in the crowd shouting out what it actually is, or I don't know if that's right, but there's this connection between the right brain and left brain. And for multiple reasons, somebody can live without the connection between the two halves of their brain. Some people it's severed because they have severe epilepsy, and it's one drastic way of treating epilepsy is to just snip that part of the brain, and they have some after effects. Some people are actually born this way, and I actually heard an NPR story about some of them. But here's what's fascinating about it. That scientists have found humans like this and done experiments on them, which I think is kind of cruel, but kind of cool because we learn about stuff. And what they do is they figured out that there's a way that you can communicate through what's called the left optic system. You can show a sentence to this one part of your optic input system that for these people will only go to their right brain. Okay, and then they can show them something in just normal vision, and their left brain will see it because that's what left brain does. Right brain doesn't do any communication. You can't understand language or create it or anything. But when they do this certain thing and show a question to the right brain, the left hand, which is attached to it, can actually spell things with tiles to respond to those questions. And what's crazy about these people is they're unaware of the two conversations because they have no connection between the two halves of the brains. Follow? Okay, so they did this on this 12-year-old boy or something like that. And Mike told me there's a YouTube clip of this. I haven't seen it. You can actually go watch this. And they were just kind of experimenting with it. And the first thing they did is they asked his left brain, by showing him just a piece of paper, what do you want to do when you're older? And the left brain can communicate, speak, and said, oh, I want to be an engineer, which makes sense. And then they did the optic thing, and they showed the same question to his right brain, and his hand spelled out, I want to be an artist, which is kind of cool. That's kind of like how we stereotype left brain, right brain. But his brains didn't agree on what he wanted to be when he was older. And he had no idea that his brains were having this conversation. So then, and this was really kind of sad, but they just showed the phrase girlfriend question mark. And his left brain said, no, I don't have a girlfriend. Meanwhile, his left hand was spelling out the name of one of the cute technicians who was administering the test. And he had no idea. And actually, Science Mike told me when you see on the video, he actually blushes when he looks down and sees that he didn't even know what was going on. He's like, oh no, it's like revealing that he has a crush on the girl sitting right there. Super sad, but awesome. But here's the point I really wanted to get to. They did the same thing to another man who had split brain, and they asked him a deeper, more interesting question. They said, do you believe in God? And so he said, with his left brain and vocally, he said, no, I don't. I used to believe in God. He said, I grew up believing in God, but I've matured, and there's things that make me think it's inconsistent. I'm actually someone who's not theistic. And then they showed it to his right brain, and his left hand spelled out, I will always believe. How cool is that? Here's my point. We are doing a series called Atheism in Lent. Because one of the things that Mark and I are doing for Lent, and she's behind actually, but is we're kind of taking this course, this Irish philosopher is put out called Atheism for Lent. And I love the idea of this complexity that the human brain can actually believe in God and not believe in God at the same time. And that we may not even be aware of that. I love the idea that there's more to us than just a binary. We're not all just ones and zeros. It's not just atheists and theists out there. There's a lot of theists out there that have a lot of doubts. There's a lot of atheists that have a lot of doubts or hope in God. There's all sorts of convoluted mixtures of emotions and thought processes, which is really, really cool. Now, Atheism for Lent, the idea is, and kind of what I'm going through in this spiritual process, is just immersing myself. This is actually kind of a course that I'm going through. And it's something I've always done. I've always been fascinated with atheistic literature. And I'm not going to bore you, and we're not going to get super intellectual, and I'm not going to try to give you a college lecture on what some of these great atheist minds are, but I'm just going to give little snippets each week that can challenge us in our own Christian thinking. Why are we doing this? If you were here last week, it's because we want to be healthy people. We want to listen to critics from the outside and say, hey, are they right about some stuff? And actually, I would propose that the reason we're doing this is I think they are right about some things about Christianity. So last week we looked at Marx, and we talked about his famous quote about religion being the opium of the people. It's not going to be that different today, but I want to go backwards to an atheist philosopher who's way lesser known. And I bring it up because atheists are kind of famous in the same way that we have great theologians throughout history. There's been some really influential non-theistic thinkers. There's kind of some categories for them. There's what they call the unholy trinity. In the 1800s, you see the beginning of Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, who other authors have called the unholy trinity because of their influence on ultimately the 20th century in their thinking. And then you have kind of what I call the four atheists of the apocalypse, the neo-atheists, Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris. These are kind of the modern voices, the late Christopher Hitchens, he just passed, but that have really shaped our experience in life, the loudest voices of atheism. But we're not going to talk about any of them today. We're going to go back farther to the beginning of the 1800s to a guy named Ludwig Feuerbach. Who popped out of bed this morning thinking, I want to go to church and learn about Ludwig Feuerbach? Nobody? I was just a shot in the dark. Maybe somebody. Here's the deal. He influenced the unholy trinity. He laid the groundwork, especially for Freud and Marx. And he did that with a very seminal work called The Essentials of Christianity, in which, this book, he tried to destroy why people have Christian faith. That's what he wanted to do. So he's a critique of Christianity. He wants to say, I can show you why people believe in God. And he laid the foundation for Freud's later work by saying, all religion is a blank space that we have out there with which we project our needs for control or loving or acceptance on. So when you ask a man about his God, you will learn about that man. Now, I think I have one quote from Feuerbach. This is second service special. First service didn't get this. He says, the present age prefers the sign to the thing signified, the copy to the original, fancy to reality, the appearance to the essence. For in these days, illusion only is sacred and truth profane. The reason I chose that kind of obscure quote is because I actually fully agree with this. And one of the things that I want to stand as a critique to transition us to Scripture today is that I fully agree with him mostly about how religion is people just projecting their own ideas onto a God or a deity. How do I know that you already believe this? Because most likely you already intuitively critique other religions in this way. It's not very hard to look at radical Islam. I'm not talking about the 1.15 billion peaceful Muslims who have a very moderate and different way of understanding their text. I'm talking about radical terrorist Islamic people. It's not hard to look at them and go, wait, their God seems to be very angry and punishing, and they seem to be very angry and punishing. You can see a reflection in themselves. We can do this in all cultures, and it's very easy to do it when we're not talking about ourselves. We're talking about other people. Go, that's funny that your belief system actually looks an awful lot like you. Therein is a very challenging question. Does your God, your conception of God, just a big version of your idealized self? Or maybe your dad or your mom? See, we need to let atheists ask really important questions, because the reality is, unfortunately, they're probably right for a lot of us. I'm personally challenged by this. And yet, deep, interesting Christianity and faith will call us to a sort of understanding of a God that transcends the universe and yet is also willing to be immanent and present in a whole different, diverse way of understanding who God is. Now, here's the one point we're going to do today. The one way in which I think Feuerbach is very poignant today is that I think one of the characteristics that we put on to God is the need for certainty. See, we as humans, and you and I'm very much included in this, we need things to be organized. This is the way our brains work. We need structures, and we certainly need certainty, in an ironic statement. We have to have black and white. We have to know what's truth and what's not. We have to know what we believe and what we don't believe. Therefore, we often project onto God that God must also need certainty. He must also need to have belief that's certain and lacking of doubt. I want to challenge that today with a story from Scripture. It's one of my favorites, and I want to ask you to see it in a different way. It's a really weird passage from the Gospels. It's got demons in it. It's got foaming at the mouth. It's got crazy stuff all about it, elements that are hard to understand. But I want to ask you to look at this story today through the lens of art. And here's what I mean by that. Art has a unique way of communicating truth. How many of you have seen a painting that affects you in some way and you want to see that painting again? Anybody? Everybody should raise your hand because it makes you look really smart and sophisticated. Even if you haven't, just pretend like you have, because it's cool to see art like it. I saw a painting one time at my old church that I used to go to in Dallas, Texas. They had these giant murals, and one of them was a Picasso painting called Guernica. Anybody ever seen this particular painting? Raise your hand again, I'll make you look cool. You can lie, it's all right, there's one. All right, so this painting is really weird. It's a Picasso painting that's very dark. It's got horse heads bleeding and all sorts of stuff. And what's neat about it is the church that we went to at the time used it as a really artful way of presenting the gospel. They had this really interesting painting about creation and nature that kind of gave the idea that the world was created beautiful. And then they had Guernica, and it's got war and bloody horses. It's kind of like their way of saying this is about human brokenness and sin. And then they had this, I think it was Salvador Dali, really interesting picture of the crucifixion, the cross, and this resurrection painting. And they were kind of saying like, hey, Guernica is about sin, which is true in some way. But I love the painting. I couldn't get enough of it. In fact, when I was in Barcelona, I was looking everywhere. And I went to Picasso's museum. They didn't have it because they had just moved it to Madrid, and I was angry because I wanted to look at it real and see if it affected me in some way or communicated something to me. And certainly Picasso meant something dark by it, but I don't know what it was. But I want you to look today at this passage, this weird, almost dark passage from the Gospels, and see what truth jumps out to you. And me, as kind of an art critic in this case, I'm going to point at one piece of the painting and try to make a really important truth point about it. But it's a story that can't be limited to just the angle I'm going to give it today. It's more complicated than that. It's found in Mark chapter 9. It's unique to Mark. He's the only one that tells it. I'm always fascinated by stories like that in the Gospels. And it's not like Mark, because Mark is kind of like a machine gun gospel writer. He just tells stories real fast and rapid. It's just like drinking from a fire hydrant. And yet here he tells a long story, longer than Mark's usual stories. Let's go there and take a look at what's happening. This is Mark 9, verse 14. It says, when they came to the other disciples, and actually I should probably stop there. The thing that just happened is the transfiguration. Mark's just told us about a very mystical, mysterious experience where 3 of Jesus' best friends got to go up on a mountain and experience God revealed in a light, talking about the divinity of Jesus, and just blown away. And Peter wants to make tabernacles and stay up there. And he's like, no, we got to go back down the valley. Cool story. This is what happens after that. They come back down to the other disciples. It says they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. Now, if you've been in the comments before, you know I'm not going to pass over that paragraph. It's got all the stuff I love to point out. There's crowds around Jesus and the followers of Jesus, because Jesus was unbelievably attractive and polarizing, and people had to see what he was going to do. But I don't know of any other intro paragraph to a story that has so beautiful a piece of art. By the way, this isn't the piece of the painting I really want to focus on, but let's just glance at it again. It says that they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him, talking about Jesus. And when we look at this piece of the painting, this narrative that Mark is weaving together for us about Jesus, I would ask the question, is that your experience of American Christianity and Jesus? How many people do you know that are overwhelmed with wonder at the person of Jesus Christ and go running to learn more about him? Thankfully, I've met a few. And I would like to say on some spiritual level, I've been one of those people, and I hope you have too. But this is one of the things that kind of makes me ache for what Christianity should be. When I look at this piece of the art, I'm going, man, that sounds like a Jesus I want to know more about. Overwhelmed with wonder and running to see what this guy was about. Here's where the story gets weird. It says, what are you arguing with them about? Jesus asked, because there's an argument going on. Verse 17, a man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. Now, Mark is weaving a tale. He's telling us the story that he either was there for or somebody that was there told him about. And he's passing it on and writing it. And here, as he's telling this narrative, he paints a pretty grisly picture, a weird picture. Now, I know many of you are probably way more well acquainted with the oddities and awkwardness of severe mental illness or crazy situations at hospitals or in the home, or maybe yourself. And these are difficult situations to be around. If you've ever been around someone having a seizure, it's difficult. My own wife has gone into some neurological seizures. A few years ago, we were at the hospital, and I can tell you I've never in my life felt less control or been more terrified. It's a hard thing to see. And this is a father of a son who aches at this difficult experience. And I'm just skirting to the side the part of the painting today about what is a demon possession and mental illness and the blurred lines of all those things and what's going on in these transactions. Because that's all important and real, but it's not the truth that I really want to get at today. This is a hurting father with a son in pain, and the disciples couldn't do anything to help him out. And then it gets really weird, because Jesus is about to say things that would actually fit the narrative of God being a God of certainty. He says, you unbelieving generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. So all of a sudden, Jesus is saying, well, it's just because you didn't believe, is what it appears to be talking about. It says, so they brought him, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. So it had been an intellectual dialogue, and now it's tangible and real. Jesus is seeing the pain and awkwardness of the situation right in front of him. A strange verse, 21, Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? And I just think this is weird, because you got a guy that's just literally seizing or flipping out or demon-possessed, rolling around, foaming at the mouth, and Jesus is like, so how long has this been going on? It's just a little bit too chill for me. But I love that about Jesus. He's not overwhelmed by the awkwardness of the situation. He just engages a conversation with the Father. And he says from childhood is the answer. It's often thrown him into fire or water to kill him, which is another interesting historical note of this narrative. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Now I love this because it's just human. Any dad in this situation is just saying, if you can do anything, just help, please. I'm desperate. And I don't know if he's heard of Jesus. Surely he has at this time in this small community circle that Jesus ran around. I don't know what level of intellectual assent he has to the teachings of Jesus or what Jesus can and can't do, but he clearly has some struggle. He's saying, if you can do anything. And Jesus notices it. Verse 23, if you can, question mark, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. And again, we see the narrative arc that Mark is taking us on. We know the direction of the story. This is about faith. This is going to be about believing. That's what we're going to hear about here. And what a great sentence, by the way. If you just believe, everything is possible for you. That's a crazy great thought. That's like a motivational speaker. I mean, do you think that that's true? Like, do you believe that if you want to be in the NBA, you can? It's going to be tough if you're 68. It may not be possible. But there's something in that that's kind of beautiful, and it's like art. We have to look at it again, and go, what does that mean? Am I missing out on something? Am I believing enough? And can that make something happen? But here's where the twist in the story comes, and the narrative arc takes a turn. It says, immediately the boy's father exclaimed, or yelled out in the Greek, I do believe, as expected, semicolon, help me overcome my unbelief. Now see, this to me is the twist in the plot. The story's headed in a very clear direction about belief versus unbelief, certainty versus uncertainty. It looks like this story is going to be about Jesus teaching about belief, and all of a sudden, the guy does not respond as expected. He's desperate, and he yells out, I do believe, but help me with my unbelief. And I love it. This is the part of the painting I want you to stare at. I want you to meditate on it. I want you to think about it. I want you to understand that this man had a unique, complex, beautiful faith because he cried out in desperation to Jesus with all sorts of doubt and unbelief, but enough belief to say, I believe, help me with my unbelief. Now, I'm going to just tell you the rest of it for time's sake. He heals the guy. That's the end of the story. It's kind of weird. He kind of looks like a corpse for a while. And Jesus says something really cryptic about some things take a lot of prayer. And some versions say prayer and fasting, but that's a later addition in the early centuries. And that would have been nice because it would have fit in with Lent really well, but that probably wasn't in the original Mark. But Jesus heals this person in response to a very complicated faith, but so what? How does that actually tangibly translate into our everyday life? Well, let me start with a challenge to this message. Because if I were sitting in your seat, the first thing I would think is like, oh, okay, this is a kind of a cool story. But there's also elements about Jesus talking about childlike faith. And when we think of a child's faith, we think about faith with certainty, right? Not if you have children. If you have children, you know how complicated something like belief or faith is. And this is straight from Mark. I was asking her on the drive up here, hey, give me an example that'll help me with what I'm trying to communicate about faith, which is pretty much 90% of my messages is Marcus' brain and my loud mouth. But she remembered a story that I also remembered when she reminded me. And it was the first time that Aspen, our little girl, held a tarantula in her hand. And our kids are big tarantula holders because we make them. And I grew up holding tarantulas because tarantulas are the bunny rabbit of spiders, as everyone knows. They're soft and cuddly. They can get angry and show you their big fangs, but they're all bark and no bite. And so I actually had a kind of an existential crisis the first time I handed a tarantula to Aspen, who was about 3 years old at the time. And the problem was, she didn't just receive the tarantula. She was kind of scared or something. I couldn't get it. I was kind of angry. I was like, not in this family, because I'm kind of a tyrant. And she literally clenched up. Her muscles tightened. She was afraid. She was at the verge of tears, and I was kind of feeling like this might be child abuse. I don't know what's going on. And I put the spider on her, and she stays tense, and it crawls on her, and she's just looking away. And I'm so disappointed that she doesn't love spiders naturally at 3 years old. Because I know arachnophobia can't be a real thing. Unless you have a dad like me, and you'd be terrified of spiders. But she endured it, and then she gave it back. And then she was able to process a little bit. Oh, that was cool. And she's held many tarantulas since that day. But here's the part that was weird. Marco or me, one, I don't remember which, we were talking to her afterwards. We were just kind of like, why were you so scared? You know? And she goes, I just was scared because tarantulas are the most poisonous spiders. You'll die if they bite you. She actually believed that that was the most poisonous spider alive, and that she would die if it bit her. That is childlike faith. Filled with doubt, filled with unbelief, but willing to go on in some crazy way. I don't know why. Maybe it's because she's scared of her psycho dad, or maybe she has some sort of trust in her parents that things are going to be okay. But childlike faith can be as complicated as your and I faith. It's very, very complicated. And that's a very beautiful thing. See, Feuerbach does this thing, and I want to critique him a little bit, even though I really appreciate his stance, is that he kind of paints religion in a way that's actually beautiful. I think that is a good critique of all religion. But he's oftentimes creating a straw man of what faith is. He's only dealing with that kind of surface, human, animalistic need for a projection of God onto a screen. And I'm afraid he may not be wrestling with the more interesting types of faith. He may not actually be critiquing the kind of faith that has room for doubt in it. The kind of faith that this desperate father had, that Jesus, the incarnate God, honored. My wife gave me another analogy. It comes from her counseling thing, acceptance and commitment therapy. She reads all sorts of nerdy books that I don't understand. But this is a pretty analogy I understood. She said that one of the ways they look at something like unbelief or dealing with something unpleasant in life is that you think of an analogy of a beach ball. You're standing in the ocean or a pool, and you have the idea that you want to just push this beach ball underwater. And the reason they use this analogy is because they believe that, especially something like unbelief, this is actually what a lot of us do in reaction to something like doubt. We just push it as far away from us as we can, right? We got to keep it away. I don't want it. It's uncomfortable. It's unbelief. It doesn't fit my system. I want to push it down. What happens when you push a beach ball underwater? Well, the farther you push it, the more rocket it becomes. That's why we push beach balls underwater, right? That's the party of it. But you might get hit in the face the farther you push this thing that's uncomfortable away. And so for some people, doubt is the kind of thing that they go to all costs to push as far away from them, suppress that they can. But you're just loading the gun. For some people, they have the opposite reaction. The doubt, the only thing they know to do with it is to stick their face on it. And just live it. And then you can't see anything else but beach ball or doubt. And it's funny to me because this is kind of the binary. This is the polar opposite of the extremes. You have people that push it away and they fight and they say, I have no doubts, I'm certain, I'm full, and I have certainty. And not only that, I'm going to project it onto God. And He must be the same way. And He must need perfect faith from me to be accepted. I beg to differ. And so did Jesus on that day with that man. And so the question for us is, are we doing one of those two things? Are we living in doubt? That we can't see anything else? Or could we perhaps, would it be too outside of the box to insinuate that maybe we should play with the beach ball? Maybe we should have such security and openness in our own complex, interesting faith that we can even play with doubt. That we even take the risk of doing atheism for Lent and having a space for it in our belief so that it's a much richer version, one that can't so easily be mocked by atheists in a straw man argument because it has space for that beautiful diversity within it. We're going to come to the communion table to end our time today. And we always kind of hammer home the inclusive, open side of the communion table. And there may be some of you here that have had some reticence or you've been a little bit slow to come to the communion table, and for the reason that you have some doubt or unbelief. Well, let me just tell you, we have split brains. And you're welcome at the communion table. You don't have to come, but you're welcome. There's no test here. There's not even a test that could be conceived that could see if you have 100% belief, or 80% belief, or 30% belief, because it appears that that doesn't really matter. The last analogy I want you to think of as we come to the communion table came from the same Peter Rollins that's kind of taken me through this Atheism and Lent course. He said that faith often is taught in our context as a holding on of something, a grasping something to grab and control. And that's, by the way, one of the things that atheists critique so often. But for Peter Rollins, he says faith is actually the opposite of that. Faith is being held. And the analogy he uses is that of a small child on its mother's breast. He says that faith should be a lot more like being held by your mother and experiencing that love, and a lot less like trying to grasp a mother's love from an infant. Because that's the problem. A lot of times we are into this projection of a God who needs certainty, and we've got to figure it out with systematic theology and all those kind of things, and maybe we just need to be held. Maybe the most interesting faith is just being in God. Communion is like that. Communion is the kind of faith that's, maybe it feels like a spider, maybe it's terrifying, and you're just like, I'm filled with doubt, belief. Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. Maybe it's not. You know, my other kids just grab spiders and we're like, going all over them, no big deal. Faith looks different for everybody. The communion table is open for you to experience Christ in a really tangible, beautiful way, to take Christ in us. The last thought I want to leave you with is the thought of what this table is about. See, this table is about death and resurrection. We believe that the mystery of the bread and the wine is a picture of Christ's death and resurrection. But here's the thing about resurrection that I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm going to hammer home on Easter, so this is a spoiler alert. See, resurrection isn't that interesting if you really think about it on a scientific level. Like, for instance, if we saw on the news tonight a video footage of a man that's dead, completely dead, and resurrected, I guess it's interesting. You'd be like, whoa, that's weird. That doesn't fit my understanding of science. Something must be going on there. Probably wouldn't change my life unless something resurrects in me. See, what makes Jesus' resurrection mean anything is that it happens over and over and over again. At the communion table, we take God in us because it's not just an intellectual assent or a certainty about a historical event. It's the belief that Jesus' resurrection has been multiplied 1,000,000 times over and will be multiplied again tonight. Resurrection matters when it happens in us. You know, Lazarus raised from the dead, and none of us are Lazarus-gens. You know, we're not following a faith of Lazarus. He was raised from the dead. We follow Christ because his resurrection was his godness, and his resurrection happens in us. So I want to invite you today to the communion table to take Christ in you. And remember, as he instructed us, his body broken for us, his blood spilled. And remember that the result of that, and the picture I often think of in my own weird little scientific mind sometimes when I'm taking communion and I'm biting that cracker or bread or whatever I am, I'm remembering that I'm crushing Christ. That I'm guilty. That God chose to take violence. Part of the reason is because of me and my rebellion. I'm crushing Christ, and he's volunteering for that role. And then I take the blood, the spilt blood, which is beautiful and mythical and poetic and deep and truer than we can even understand truth. And that blood washes away in my mouth. And I'm made clean and I'm made new. And now Christ is in me. His death is in me. Forgiveness is made available. And guess what? Then resurrection happens. And that's when we get up and leave and we're together. And we're a resurrected body to this world that brings Christ to Flagstaff. So you're invited to the communion table today. As always, we have 4 places. Everyone welcome. It's optional. There's many appropriate reasons that you should feel no pressure at all, but you're definitely invited to partake as the music plays. Let me pray over these elements. God, we're always so thankful for this sacrament, Lord. As you've said, to do this as often as we take drink, to remember you, God. And Lord, help us to remember the cosmic event that's central to our faith, however weak or strong it is, God, that you would become tangible and then broken and bleed, God, for our